The freight card said Nora Bell was dead. Eliza Marrin saw the stamp under the depot lantern just before midnight. When Split Rock had gone quiet, except for the tick of the cooling rails and the soft breathing of stage horses in the dark. Deceased effects. The words were pressed in black ink across a stiff card tied to a pine crate with blue waybill ribbon. Beneath the stamp, in careful depot hand, was the name. Nora Bell. Eliza did not move at first. Her fingers stayed on the edge of the crate. Her other hand held the freight clipboard against her apron. The platform smelled of dust, lamp oil, horse sweat, and hot iron left over from the day. A moth beat itself against the glass chimney of the lantern above her head. Nora Bell was not dead. 3 nights ago. Eliza had taken a wire from Nora herself. Bell alive. Hold freight. Do not ship. The message had come in broken, half swallowed by badline noise from the west. Eliza had copied it anyway. Every word she could catch. Her pencil moving fast while the brass telegraph key tapped beneath her hand like a nervous heart. Then Mr. Hasker, the station master, had walked in behind her. He read the slip once. He took it from her hand. He tore it in half and fed it to the stove. Some wires are mistakes. Miss Marrin, he had said. A smart girl learns which ones not to hear. Eliza had learned many things in Split Rock Depot. She had learned that freight weight could lie if the man at the scale was paid enough. She had learned that stage drivers asked fewer questions when their contracts came through Silas Creed. She had learned that a missing woman could become baggage with 1 stamp and 1 ribbon. Most of all, she had learned that silence did not keep a person safe. It only taught other people what they could get away with. She looked down the platform. 2 men stood near the night stage, checking harness under a low yellow lantern. One was Reuben Pike, Creed's road man. Broad-shouldered and still as a fence post. He wore his hat low and his coat open enough to show the grip of his revolver. He was not watching the horses. He was watching the crate. Eliza bent closer to the freight card as if checking the number. Seal 47B. Destination: Dry Creek Transfer. Contents: personal effects. The crate was too large for personal effects. Too heavy. Too fresh. And the nail heads had not rusted. A thin line of pine dust still clung to one corner. Like it had been built in a hurry. Eliza slipped one hand beneath the card. The blue ribbon had been tied through the wrong hole. Whoever prepared it did not know depot procedure. Or did not care. She pulled the loose tail free and broke off 3 inches of ribbon, folding it into her sleeve before anyone saw. A bootstep sounded behind her. You finding trouble in that paperwork, Miss Marrin? Reuben Pike's voice was mild. That was the worst part of him. He could sound like a man asking after the weather while standing in the doorway of another person's ruin. Eliza straightened. Just checking the waybill. That crate's already cleared. It is listed for the west stage. The west stage does not carry deceased effects after sundown. Pike smiled a little. Rules change. Not in the freight book. He stepped closer. Maybe you ought to leave the book to men who understand business. Eliza felt the ribbon hidden against her wrist. Behind Pike, another man came out of the dark near the cattle chute. He carried a stage guard's coat over one shoulder and walked like the road had worn every unnecessary motion out of him. Yonach Vale. Eliza knew the name because everybody in Split Rock knew names tied to trouble. Jonah had once guarded Creed's stage line. Men said he had quit after a job went bad near the Cimarron crossing. Men also said Silas Creed did not forgive departures. Jonah looked at Pike first. Then at Eliza. Then at the crate. Something wrong? He asked. Pike turned his head. Nothing for you. Jonah's eyes stayed on the card. Dead folks usually travel quieter. No one spoke. The horses shifted in their traces. Eliza could feel her own pulse in her throat. But her voice came out steady. This crate should be held until morning. Pike's smile disappeared. It leaves tonight. Jonah set his coat over the rail. Not until she finishes her count. Pike looked at him then. Really looked. And something old passed between the two men. Not friendship. Not fear. History. Maybe. And the kind that still had teeth. Eliza took one step back from the crate. From inside the depot office. The telegraph key began to chatter. Fast. Uneven. A message coming hard over a bad line. Eliza turned before she could stop herself. Pike saw it. Jonah saw Pike seeing it. The key tapped again. Sharp in the midnight air. Bell alive. Then, the line cut dead. The telegraph key went silent so fast the depot seemed to lose its breath. Eliza stood halfway between the crate and the office door. One hand closed around the clipboard. The stolen blue ribbon hidden against her wrist. Reuben Pike watched her from under the brim of his hat. You expecting a message? Miss Marrin? He asked. No. Then, don't trouble yourself over it. Jonah Vale moved before Eliza did. Not toward Pike. Not toward the crate. He stepped to the side. Just enough to stand between Pike and the depot office. It was a small thing. That made Eliza notice it. Pike noticed too. You working guard tonight? Val. Pike said. Not station master. I know what I'm working. Then stand by the stage. Jonah looked toward the crate. Stage isn't ready. It will be. Not if the freight count is wrong. Pike's face hardened. But only around the eyes. He was too practiced to show more. He gave Eliza one last look. The kind that put a mark on a person without touching them. Then turned back toward the horses. You got 5 minutes. He said. After that crate moves. When Pike walked away, Eliza let out a breath she had not meant to hold. Jonah did not look at her right away. He watched Pike cross the platform. Watched the 2 other men near the harness. Watched the depot windows and the road beyond them. Only then did he say, You need to leave. Eliza stared at him. That crate needs to stay. That crate is bait now. You know that. I know Pike. And Creed. His jaw shifted once. Yes. The answer was too clean to be harmless. Eliza stepped around him and went into the depot office. The telegraph table sat under the wall lamp. Brass key still warm from the last message. The paper strip had stopped mid-line. Only 2 words had come through. Bell alive. Below them. Nothing. Eliza tore the strip free and folded it into the cuff of her sleeve with the ribbon. Jonah stood in the doorway. You make a habit of stealing depot property? He asked. I make a habit of keeping what men burn. He did not smile. Good habit. She looked past him toward the crate. If that stage leaves. Nora Bell disappears inside a freight record. Jonah's eyes darkened at the name. You know her. No. Eliza said. But I heard her wire. That may be enough to get you buried in trouble. It already has. Outside. Pike shouted for the driver to check the rear trace. The night stage lanterns swung low and yellow. The horses stamped. Restless in the heat. Jonah lowered his voice. There's a cattle chute behind the depot. It runs down to the dry wash. If you take it now, you can get clear of Split Rock before Pike realizes you're gone. Eliza studied him. You know the back way too well for a hired guard. I used to move freight here. For Creed. Yes. The words sat between them. Flat and ugly. Eliza's hand tightened around the clipboard. Then why should I trust you? Jonah looked toward the platform. Where Pike's men were pretending not to listen. You shouldn't. That answer stopped her. Most men asked for trust like it was owed to them. Jonah offered none. He simply stood in the doorway with dust on his coat and old weariness in his face. I guarded Creed's stages 7 years ago. He said. I was paid to keep the road clear and ask no questions. I was good at both. And then. One shipment came through wrong. Wrong how? His gaze moved to the crate. Same kind of wrong. Eliza waited. He reached into his coat and pulled out a freight tag. Old enough that the edges had softened. The name on it had faded. But one letter still showed clear under the lamp. N. I kept it. He said. Because I did nothing when I should have. Eliza looked at the tag. Then at him. Outside. Pike called. Time's up. Jonah put the old tag away. You can hate me on the road. But if you stay here. Pike takes that ribbon from your sleeve before the stage reaches the bridge. Eliza went still. He had seen. Did you tell him? No. Will you? No. A horse squealed from the trace line. One of the stage animals jerked its leg high, favoring the left front. Jonah turned at once and crossed the platform. Eliza followed. Against her better judgment, Jonah crouched beside the horse, ran one hand down the leg, and spoke low enough that only the animal heard him. The horse settled. Pike looked annoyed. She's swelling. Jonah said. You run her tonight. She goes lame before Bitter Creek. Pike stepped closer. The stage runs. Not with this team. For a moment. It looked as if Pike might argue. Then the driver spat into the dirt and swore under his breath. He's right. That bought time. Jonah looked back at Eliza. Not long. Just enough. She understood. The crate would not leave tonight. But by morning, Creed would know why. Eliza walked into the depot office, took her shawl from the peg, and slipped the wire strip deeper into her sleeve. When she came out, Jonah was waiting near the cattle chute, with 2 canteens and a plain bay mare. You'll ride, he said. I'll lead until we clear the wash. I didn't ask you to come. No. Then why are you? He looked past the depot, toward the dark road east. Because I know where that crate was going. Eliza felt the night turn colder. Behind them, the brass telegraph key clicked once. Only once. Like a warning. They reached Bitter Creek near noon with the bay mare walking slow, and Jonah on foot beside her. Eliza had told him twice that she could walk. Both times he had said, I heard you. Then he had kept hold of the reins and stayed on the ground. That bothered her more than if he had argued. A man who argued could be answered. A man who quietly took the harder part left a person with too much room to think. Bitter Creek was hardly a town. A livery. A feed store. A church with one cracked bell. And a telegraph office squeezed between the barber and the undertaker. Dust lay thick on every porch. The American flag above the stage stop hung limp in the heat. Eliza slid down from the saddle before Jonah could offer a hand. He noticed. He did not comment. The telegraph office smelled of hot wire, ink, and old paper. Behind the counter sat a narrow man with spectacles low on his nose, one sleeve held up by a brass garter. His name was Mr. Tully, painted on the door in black letters. He looked at Eliza first. Then Jonah. Then his eyes moved to the dust on their clothes and the mare outside. You folks come from Split Rock? He asked. Eliza went still. Jonah heard it too. The question had been waiting for them. Need to send a wire. Jonah said. Tully's hand rested beside the telegraph key. Line's uncertain today. It was working when we walked in. Eliza said. Tully blinked. She stepped closer to the counter. I need a message sent to the Federal Marshal's office at Fort Hays. Mock agent. Freight fraud. Possible missing person. Request immediate. No. The word came out thin, but firm. Jonah did not move. Careful. Tully swallowed. I received a warning this morning. A woman matching her description stole depot papers from Split Rock. Traveling with a former Creed guard. Dangerous. Likely attempting extortion. Eliza felt the room tilt. Then settle. Creed had moved faster than she thought. Who sent it? She asked. Tully looked down. That answer is on your face. She said. Silas Creed. Signed by Station Master Hasker. Of course. Eliza reached into her sleeve and pulled out the narrow wire strip from Split Rock. She laid it on the counter. Bell, alive. Tully stared at the words. This came over the line last night. She said. Hasker tore the first copy. This one came after Pike tried to move the crate. Tully's mouth tightened. He wanted not to see it. Eliza knew that look. Men wore it when truth came close enough to cost them money. Jonah reached into his coat and set the old freight tag beside the wire strip. The faded letter showed under the office lamp. N. I kept that 7 years. He said. Same kind of marking. Same kind of shipment. Same men above it. Tully looked at him. I don't want trouble. No one ever does. Eliza said. That is why trouble gets comfortable. Outside. Horse hooves sounded on the street. Jonah turned his head slightly. 2 riders passed the window and slowed near the livery. Both wore dusters despite the heat. One had a red scarf at his throat. The same kind Pike's men wore at Split Rock. Eliza took the blue waybill ribbon from her cuff and laid it beside the wire and tag. Look at the punch hole, she said to Tully. Wrong side. That ribbon was tied by someone outside depot procedure. The crate was built fresh. The weight was too high for personal effects and too low for household freight. Tully looked despite himself. She had him now. Not by courage, but by habit. A man trained in wire and record could resist fear. He could not resist a wrong number. I can send 1 line. He whispered. Maybe 2 before they come asking. Eliza picked up the pencil. Jonah moved to the door and stood there. Not blocking her. Only giving her the room to work. She wrote fast. To Fort Hays Federal Office. Split Rock Depot Shipping, false deceased effects under Creed contract. Nora Bell, alive. Local court unsafe. Request, Marshal outside county. Tully read the last line and looked up. Local court unsafe. Eliza met his eyes. Send it. The key began to chatter. Each tap sounded too loud. Outside. One of the riders dismounted. The message ran. Halfway through. The line answered. Hayes receiving. Identify wit. The signal broke into static. Tully adjusted the contact screw. Lines being interrupted. From where? Jonah asked. West Relay. Split Rock. Eliza said. The key jumped again. A new message came through in broken strikes. Judge compromised. Do not file local. Then nothing. No tap. No line hum. Only the sound of the riders outside stepping onto the boardwalk. Tully's face had gone pale. Jonah looked at Eliza. We need to move. She gathered the wire strip. The ribbon. And the old tag. Not to Fort Hays. Where? Eliza looked at the dead telegraph key. If the wire can't carry the truth. We take it by hand. Outside. Someone knocked once on the office door. Not polite. Not hard. Just certain. And Jonah's hand moved close to his coat. But not inside it. The knock came again. Jonah did not draw. That was the first thing Eliza noticed. His hand stayed near his coat. Close enough to matter. But he did not reach inside. He watched the door the way a man watched weather coming over open ground. Mr. Tully stood behind the telegraph counter. Pale and useless. Eliza Marrin. A voice called from outside. Open the door. Reuben Pike. Jonah looked at the back wall. Rear exit. Tully shook his head. Storage window. Too small for me. Not for her. Eliza had already moved. She gathered the wire strip. The blue ribbon. And Jonah's old freight tag. Then slipped them into the inner pocket of her skirt. The storage room smelled of dust. Spare wire. And mouse-chewed paper. The window was narrow and set high. But she had climbed worse places as a girl. Jonah cupped his hands once. She stepped into them. He lifted without a word. Eliza pushed the window open and slid out into the alley behind the office. Her skirt caught on a nail. She tore it free and landed hard in the dirt. But stayed on her feet. A moment later. Jonah came through after her with far less grace and no complaint. Inside the office. Tully opened the front door. Eliza heard Pike's voice turn soft. Soft voices were the ones that traveled farthest in a frightened town. They cut behind the undertaker's shed. Crossed a dry wash. And came up near the churchyard. Bitter Creek's church was small. Whitewashed once and weather-worn since. A cracked bell hung in the tower. The cemetery behind it held wooden markers leaning under the heat. A woman waited beside the side gate. Mrs. Lottie Crane. Eliza stopped so suddenly Jonah nearly ran into her. Lottie wore her brown traveling shawl and held a small carpetbag in both hands. She looked older than she had 3 nights ago in Split Rock, when she had pressed a biscuit into Eliza's palm and whispered for her to run. "Child," Lottie said. Eliza felt the word hit wrong. Jonah looked from Lottie to the church road. "You know her. She helped me leave." Lottie's mouth trembled. "I did what I could." "No," Eliza said quietly. "You did what you were paid to do." Lottie closed her eyes for one short second. That was answer enough. Jonah shifted half a step, placing himself where he could see both the alley and the gate. Eliza did not look away from Lottie. "How long?" Lottie's hands tightened on the carpetbag. It was only supposed to be small things. Who rented a room? Who came through town? Who asked questions? How long? 2 years. The churchyard seemed to go still around them. A fly moved across one sun-bleached marker. Somewhere beyond the feed store, a horse struck its hoof against a hitching rail. "Creed owned the note on my boarding house," Lottie said. "After Samuel died, the bank gave me 30 days. Creed gave me a year. And took your spine for interest." Lottie flinched. Eliza hated that it hurt to say. She hated more that it was true. "I didn't know about Nora," Lottie whispered. "You knew enough to send me down the road. Pike was watching. I thought if they took the papers, they might let you go." Eliza looked at her for a long moment. That is what people say when they have already chosen who pays. Boots sounded near the church steps. Jonah turned. Pike stood at the corner of the building with 2 men behind him. No one shouted. No one ran. That was how men like Pike worked when they believed a town had already made room for them. "Miss Marrin," Pike said, "you've caused enough dust for one day." Jonah's hand moved closer to his coat. Eliza saw it. She also saw the riders near the main road. The children peeking from the church window. The old mail wagon standing behind the vestry. A shot here would bury the truth under panic. "Don't?" she said. Jonah heard her. His hand stopped. Pike smiled faintly. "Smart girl." Then the side door of the church opened. An old man stepped out wearing a mail carrier's leather pouch across his chest. His name was Asa Morrow. Eliza had seen him twice in Split Rock. Always quiet. Always with dust on his hat and letters tied in bundles by town. "I believe," Asa said. "This belongs to Miss Marrin." He tossed a small sealed pouch. Jonah caught it. Pike's smile vanished. Asa looked at Eliza. Not at Pike. "Held mail. Never sent. Came through Split Rock 4 days ago. I kept it when Hasker told me to burn the routing slip." Eliza opened the pouch with shaking fingers. Inside was a folded wire copy. "Nora Bell alive. Held under false freight. Do not ship." For the first time that day, Reuben Pike looked uncertain. Not afraid. Not yet. But uncertain. And that was enough. Asa pointed behind the church. "Back lane runs to the old stage road. Go now." Jonah looked at Eliza. This time, he did not lead. He waited for her to move first. Eliza folded Nora's wire and held it against her chest. Then she ran. They reached Split Rock before dawn. The town lay low under a gray sky. Quiet in the way a place gets quiet when too many people know trouble is coming, and nobody wants to be the first to name it. The depot lanterns still burned along the freight platform. The night stage stood hitched near the loading rail. Horses restless. Wheels packed with road dust. And beside it sat the pine crate. The blue waybill ribbon had been replaced. Eliza saw that from the edge of the cattle yard and felt her throat tighten. They had tried to clean the lie before anyone could read it. Marshal Amos Greer crouched beside her behind the stock fence. His coat gray with road dust. He had met them on the old stage road 2 hours earlier. After Asa Morrow's mail pouch reached the Federal Relay Office. Greer was not a large man. But he had the stillness of someone used to being obeyed only after earning it. "You're sure about the scale book?" he asked. "Eliza is sure." Jonah said. Greer looked at Eliza. Not Jonah. She appreciated that. The weight will be wrong. She said. Deceased effects are logged by trunk weight. That crate was logged at 112 pounds. But it sat heavier when the hands shifted it. Closer to 180. And the seal number was changed after midnight. Greer nodded once. Then we don't need noise. We need the book. The depot clock struck 5. Cracked bell, sounding thin in the cold air. On the platform, Silas Creed arrived in a dark coat, clean gloves, and a face made for polite rooms. Reuben Pike stood near the stage with 2 men behind him. Station Master Hasker carried the freight book under one arm, looking like a man who had not slept and did not deserve to. Eliza stepped out first. Jonah moved with her, but not ahead of her. That mattered. Creed saw her before Pike did. His expression did not change, but the space around his eyes tightened. Miss Marrin, he called. You've caused a great deal of inconvenience. Eliza walked onto the platform. The freight hands stopped loading. The stage driver lowered the strap in his hands. 2 ranchers waiting with cattle receipts turned from the ticket window. A woman with a market basket paused beside the depot steps. A town could pretend not to see many things. It had a harder time pretending when the truth stood on its platform before breakfast. Marshal Greer followed Eliza up the steps. His badge caught the first gray light. Hasker, Greer said. Open the freight book. Hasker swallowed. Marshal, this shipment is cleared under private contract. Open the book. Creed smiled thinly. You're welcome to inspect records through the proper court. Eliza looked at him. The local court. The smile faded a little. She reached into her coat and laid 3 things on the freight scale. The first strip of blue ribbon. The cut telegraph message from Split Rock. And Nora Bell's held wire from Ace's mail pouch. The brass pan dipped softly under almost no weight at all. Small things could still tip a morning. This card said Nora Bell was dead. Eliza said. This wire says she was alive. This ribbon came from the original waybill. And that book will show the weight was changed. Creed's voice cooled. A frightened clerk with stolen scraps is not evidence. No. Greer said. But a federal wire is. He nodded toward the depot office. Eliza went inside. The brass telegraph key sat on the desk where she had worked for 3 years under orders to hear nothing. Her hand hovered over it once. Then settled. She tapped the message slowly enough for the room outside to hear the rhythm. Federal Office Hayes. Split Rock. False freight confirmed. Hold, Creed contract. Request authority over local court. The reply came faster than breath. Authority granted. Hold shipment. Federal judge en route. Eliza tore the strip free and carried it back outside. Pike shifted near the stage. Jonah saw it. He stepped between Pike and Eliza. Not with a drawn gun. Not with a threat. Only with the full weight of a man who had decided what line would not be crossed again. Pike's hand paused near his coat. Don't. Jonah said. Quiet. Exact. Pike looked from Jonah to Greer's badge. Then to the freight hands now watching him instead of the crate. His hand dropped. Hasker opened the freight book. Eliza read the line aloud. Seal 47B. 112 pounds. Greer pointed to the crate. Open it. No one moved. Then the stage driver stepped forward. Took a pry bar from the loading rack. And set it beside the crate. Not opening it yet. Just choosing a side. That was enough for the freight hands. One came forward. Then the blacksmith. Then the woman with the market basket set her basket down and stood where she could see. Creed looked around and understood the platform had changed. Freer took the pry bar. The lid lifted. Inside were folded blankets. A woman's shoe. A torn sleeve. And a second freight card hidden under the false bottom. Eliza picked up the card. The name written there was not Nora Bell. It was her brother's. Thomas Marrin. For one long moment. Split Rock held its breath. Then Eliza looked at Silas Creed. You shipped him too. She said. Creed said nothing. That was the first honest thing he had done all morning. No one on the depot platform spoke after Eliza read her brother's name. Even the horses went quiet. Thomas Marrin had been gone 4 years. Split Rock had called it an accident. A bad fall from a freight wagon. A body never found because the planes had a way of keeping what they took. Eliza had lived with that story because she had been 17. Alone. And poor enough that truth felt like something other people could afford. Now his name sat on a hidden freight card beneath a false bottom. Marshal Amos Greer took the card from her carefully. Not because she could not hold it. Because she had held enough. Silas Creed looked at the platform. At the freight hands. At the stage driver. At the ranchers who had once nodded to him in the street. The town had not turned loud. That would have been easier. It had turned still. And stillness was harder for men like Creed to buy. This proves nothing, Creed said. Eliza looked at the open crate. It proves you needed a second bottom. Greer stepped forward. Silas Creed. You are under federal hold pending inquiry into false freight, obstruction of mail, and missing person transport records. Creed's eyes moved to Hasker. The station master looked away. That was when Creed understood the shape of the morning. His saloon still stood. His lawyers still had names. His money was still locked somewhere behind polished wood. But the platform had stopped belonging to him. Pike did not resist when Jonah took the gun from his belt and handed it to Greer. Hasker sat down on a freight stool like his knees had become uncertain. The stage driver cut the team loose from the crate wagon and led the horses to water. A small act. By noon, everyone in Split Rock had heard of it. The stage left without Creed's freight. Before sundown, 2 federal deputies rode in from Hayes with dust on their coats and a sealed order in a leather pouch. By the next morning, Creed's private freight contract was suspended. Hasker was removed from the depot office. The Silver Spur Saloon was locked under federal seal until the back records could be taken. The territorial judge Creed had counted on was no longer handling the matter. His name had traveled by wire faster than any man could ride to warn him. That was how power began to crack in Split Rock. Not with a gunshot. With a telegraph key. For 3 days. Eliza sat at the depot desk and wrote. She wrote Nora Bell's name first. Then Thomas Marrin's. Then the names from waybills. Damaged tags. Held wires. And shipments marked wrong and sent quiet. She did not write what she could not prove. She did not soften what she could. On the 4th morning, Federal Judge Harrow arrived from Hayes and read her pages beside the freight scale. You kept all this in your head? He asked. Eliza's fingers rested near the brass key. Not all, she said. Some of it stayed because no one else would keep it. He did not praise her. She was grateful for that. He simply said, then we will put it where men cannot burn it. Just after noon. The wire from Hayes came in. Nora Bell located. Safe under federal care. Statement to follow. Eliza read it twice. Then she folded the strip and placed it beside Nora's name in the record book. By evening, the statement came through in pieces. Nora had seen the inside of a freight room. She had heard men use the words deceased effects. She had remembered Eliza's name because Eliza had once sent a wire for her without charging the full fee. Eliza copied every word. Not everything came back. But one living name had made it through. That mattered. The town changed slowly after that. Freight hands stopped touching crates without reading the cards twice. Stage drivers refused sealed cargo unless the weight matched the book. The depot board was repainted. And under new rule, every personal effects shipment required duplicate wire notice to Hayes. Mrs. Lottie Crane left her boarding house before the month ended. No crowd followed her. No one shouted. A single notice appeared on her old door, saying the house was closed for unpaid debt. By evening, someone had taken the sign down and turned it face first against the wall. Eliza saw it and felt no triumph. Only the tired ache of a wound finally uncovered. Jonah stayed near Split Rock through the inquiry. He gave his statement. Named the old routes. And handed over the faded freight tag he had kept for 7 years. When Judge Harrow asked whether testifying might place Jonah under scrutiny too, Jonah did not look away. Yes. Sir, he said. That is why I am saying it plain. Eliza heard that from the depot doorway. It did not erase what he had once failed to ask. But it proved he would not stay silent again. When the first hearings were done, Jonah waited on the platform while Eliza locked the telegraph office. You could ride west, she said. I could. Will you? He looked toward the stage road. Not today. Eliza held the office key in her palm. The new station master had offered her the position of chief relay clerk that morning. Fair wage. Her own desk. Authority to stop any shipment that did not read clean. She had not answered yet. Jonah glanced at the brass key through the window. You taking it? The job? Yes. She looked at the depot board. Nora Bell's name was written under federal protection. Not erased. Not hidden. Beneath it was Thomas Marrin's name. No longer filed as accident. No longer left to dust and rumor. Pending federal record. It was not a grave. It was not an answer to every year she had waited. But it was no longer a lie. Yes. Eliza said. For now. Jonah nodded once. Then I reckon I'll be close enough if you need a witness. Eliza looked at him. Not a guard. No. Jonah said. You never needed one of those. For the first time in a long while. Something in her chest loosened without breaking. She locked the depot door. Inside. The brass telegraph key rested on the desk. Quiet for the moment. Ready when called. Beside it lay a folded strip of blue waybill ribbon. No longer hiding a secret. Only marking where one had ended. Outside. The morning train whistled far down the line. Carrying names west. East. And finally into record. Eliza Marrin stepped onto the platform beside Jonah Bell. Not behind him. Not ahead of him. Beside him. And Split Rock, whether it liked it or not, had learned to hear her. This is a fictional story created for entertainment. Any resemblance to real people, places, or events is purely coincidental.